This is going to be, I think I call this shared reading engagement. What it is, how and when does it occur, and how to study it. So this is going to sound kind of like an hour and a half long talk, but it won't be. It will just be a few hints about the ways that I've been thinking about this phenomenon. So am I now on the, how do I move this? Like this? Yeah. Is that it? Yeah. So my initially sort of fascination when I came across this phenomenon was the relation between shared reading and mental health. So I thought, why is that? And I started to looking into the literature on bibliotherapy, and I really didn't find anything there, because there was a theory on identification, and that was the most I came up with. But what happened, so it's also a history about what happens when one field moves into another field. So this was the field of literature moving into the field of medicine. It happened now in the First World War. There was a lot of war veterans that came back to the US, and they had no idea what to do with them. So they started to suddenly involve the libraries in the mental health treatment, and found that it could have some kind of calming, consolidating effect on these war veterans reading groups. But they had no idea what it was that the reading was doing in it. So really as soon as also in the past century, as the evidence-based medicine paradigm was growing, and they wanted really out of the goodness to say, okay, we want to find some solid ground for this, because we see that it does something, that it is working, but we don't know why it is working or how it works. So they wanted to evidence-base bibliotherapy, but as they didn't have a theory about what literary reading is at all, they actually ended up killing it. And now if you Google or look up bibliotherapy, what you find is cognitive bibliotherapy. So that is people reading self-help books. And they actually have evidence base for that. So it shows that if you have a light to moderate depression, then you are giving these self-help or self-administering programs, you will see an effect. But there's nothing within bibliotherapy now about literary reading, because basically people, they don't know what it is doing. There's very few studies, and but it's completely black box. You have a set of hypotheses here, and then you have people reading, but there's nothing about what was read or how it was read or for how long or with whom or anything, and then they're testing something at the end. So really that whole field has died. So I was also not very sure about that a theory of identification is a theory about literary reading. So starting to look into the literature about literary reading also from a reader response perspective, and thinking about, and maybe you have said all about this yesterday? No, because I know that you know more about this than I do. But so I was starting to look into engagement. So I'll talk a little bit about that, and again at the end about the relation to mental health. So if we can just, so this is it's sort of a very, very old theory developed by Carolyn Schroeds. She said that, so this was when bibliotherapy was started to being formulated some more than 50 years back. She says that, so the parameters that she identified was identification, including projection and introjection. So you had a lot of psychoanalysis there luring at the background. She says catharsis was one of the things that she was luring to, and insight leading to self-recognition. And she very much emphasized that for this therapeutic process, catharsis and insight to happen, you would have identification. And then what happened in the field of bibliotherapy was that you would even create, so you believe that it was identification. So if you have, I've even seen it to the point in the literature that if you people are suffering now with self-harm and young girls cutting themselves, but you don't have a book that deals with this, they will write a book, a literary book that deals with this, because they believe so strongly that it is the identification which carries the therapeutic process forward. And for the identification to happen, it will have to have a very strong match at the level of between the targeted problem and whatever that person needs to be believed of, I guess, something like this. Whether it's self-esteem or bullying or something else, or cutting. So there's a very, very sort of strong issue of instrumentalization, and here I can perhaps rely a bit on what you were saying earlier today, Andreas, because I think this is another problem with bibliotherapy, the way that I've seen it is that it's always used with a therapeutic outcome in mind. So you might pick up a book, but it is always used for some purpose which is not the reading experience itself, but for some stipulated problem for which there should be a cure. So it's a guided use of reading, and always with a therapeutic outcome in mind. And one of the things that I found, which relates back to what Andreas was talking about this morning about extrinsic and intrinsic motivation, is that as soon as you do this in a reading group, you say that you're reading for a therapeutic purpose, this will never happen. So it's something else. It's something else that happens in the course of reading. But obviously also I agree with Andreas that it's not as easy as you can say that it will have to be, it's only intrinsic motivations which are good and not extrinsic motivations. It will have to be, because there isn't a part of instrumentalization reading therapeutically, which is when you find that this is of interest to me. So I think perhaps what was said earlier today, that the concept of interest perhaps is even more interesting than whether it's one kind of motivation or the other. Yeah. So from there, so I was not very happy with the idea that it was just a matter of that people would have some kind of problem and would have to read about this problem, and it would be the reading about this problem that would relieve them of their mental health problems. I thought there was something else going on in the very process of reading. So it was also interesting to say, was it you, or was it the guy sitting next to you who said, I think perhaps it was, yes, it was you, saying that that it was not necessarily because you were starting to, no, it was you, yes, relating it to a personal, I mean, you could feel, you were touched by the literature or by the poem, although you didn't, and you could sort of recognize the sorrow within it, not even, but without having to relate it to personal experiences of grief or pain or anything like this. So I think it doesn't have to be that sort of very sort of one-to-one match between a very particular personal experience and the same thing treated in the literature. So one of the things that I was curious to see was that it seemed that that was when I was starting to do reading groups in psychographic settings. And one thing that I started to notice was that people, they would become engaged with the literature in different ways. And it seemed, and they would, the way in which they responded to the reading and the way in which they would talk about the outcome of the reading was to some extent, but this was still at a very sort of explorative level, would somehow be related to the kind of engagement that I would see them, how they would participate and how they would interact in the reading group would be a sort of would have a correlation to the outcome of the reading group. So I went to study or read about engagement, and I just have something to drink. This is and I went to the field of reader response, and I found something which was very interesting because it sort of defined or identified forms of engagement that I had been observing in the reading groups that I was conducting. And so they gave a name for something that I had been observing, namely expressive engagement. So what they said was that and they also made a relation between, in an article of Don Kuyken and David Mile, they said that, where they talk about locating what they call self-modifying feelings in reading. That it happens that people, they can modify their feelings in the course of reading, but it doesn't happen for all readers. It happens for certain readers having certain kinds of engagement. And when it happened, the thing that they were able to identify is this that they call expressive engagement, which is characterized by, now I have to read, felt involvement in the narrative, but also autobiographical associations and engagement with sensory imagery. So they were both engaged with the narrative and with the text, with the sensory felt qualities of the text, but also somehow getting themselves in there in the text somehow. In contrast, they found, so they made a sort of a whole plot about different kinds of reading engagement, and in contrast they found that people who does what they call allegoresis, so a symbolic reading, which many of us were taught in high school, where you have to see that the rose stands for love or something like this. That is not expressive engagement, and they would not, if people do this kind of symbolic reading, they would not experience what they call self-modifying feelings in the course of reading. Also, if people, they do what they call autobiographical assimilation, which is still within the expressive engagement, but would not be attentive, for instance, to sense qualities in the text, they would not experience it. Also, if they did what they call autobiographical diversion, so this is when people in the reading groups happens very often say that, okay, this reminds me of, and then they jump out of the text into an autobiographical memory, but they will never turn back to the text. So that is actually why the initial program, I think, was called Get Into Reading, because it is obviously about making those connections, of drawing on personal experiences, but not in order to say, okay, I have had a similar experience, and then now I'm just going to be talking about this experience. And I have had that in the reading group so many times, and it always shows that when people they do this, they will actually not have a therapeutic outcome of the reading. It was just be another chance to talk about a story that they have spoken of 50 times, and now they're going to talk about it again, but not experiencing self-modification and feeling. So there's also, of course, non-engagement, people that are simply not engaged. And then if people are only attentive to the aesthetic level, so only to the sensory imagery, but does not make the autobiographical relation or the engagement with the narrative, they will not experience it either. So there's something about that this kind of engagement has to be at one time focused on the self, on the reader, but also on the text. So there has to be sort of a dual, or I wouldn't say a split attention, because actually one of the ways that they measure it is that they look at metaphorical identification, and when people they start in English, we don't have this in Danish, but when they start to use the you, the impersonal you, that's one very strong indicator that people will experience what they call self-modification in reading, because you will start to blur your own experiences with those of the narrators to the point where you can where it's you, and you cannot say where your own experience and that of the narrator ends. Yeah, the paradigm that they use to study this, they call it the expressive and striking passages. So they ask people either in a lab setting but also at home to read a text, a poem, and then they ask them to underline evocative and striking passages in the course of reading. I also found that very interesting, because that is actually, in a sense, the way in which the shared reading groups are conducted, that people are asked to comment on whatever they find evocative and interesting. So it is, and then they ask them to go back and elaborate on why they found those passages evocative and striking, and then they do an analysis of what they call development of effective themes through these passages, with one of the things that they pay attention to is whether they have this blurred self-other distinction, for instance, exemplified in the use of the impersonal you. At the same time, there was another study conducted on the shared reading groups. This is the only study that has been sort of semi-controlled study that has been conducted on shared reading groups in a population of people suffering from depression, where they also found that there was this tendency for people to pay attention to words, phrases, lines, all the sensory qualities of the text, also be involved with the narrative, but also not just relating it to personal experience. So there seems to be some of the same things that goes on in expressive reading, which also goes on in shared reading groups. These are some of the questions that you'll often find in a shared reading group. So it underlies or points to that it is a distinction between, or sort of a measurement between textual focus and experiential, but also extended self-focus. Both what happens in the text, in terms of narrative, character, place, setting, themes, description, language, but also what happens in you while you read. How does something feel? What does it remind you of? What are the reflections, feelings, thoughts that emerges while you read? So that brings me to this point that I've been thinking about for some time now, which I think perhaps is the point that I will have share an interest with perhaps with Andreas, and who else is going to be talking today? Who talks about education?
That's me.
That is you. So, so one thing is, so for a long time people have been asking this question. There's been this idea or sort of intuition that there is something which is therapeutic about reading. Is reading good for us? This is sort of the grand big question, and people have been coming back to it. And I mean, we have to give it up on several occasions for several reasons, because you cannot say that just because there's great literature around, the world has suddenly become a better place. And that's another reason for me to look at engagement, because it's obviously the world isn't a better place because of literature. So why can literature still be good for us? So my hypothesis is that it can do something in relation, or the outcome will have to depend somehow, this is my hypothesis, on the level or the kind of engagement that you have. So it's just not the literature, it's the interaction that there is between a reader and a piece of literature. And obviously the literature plays an important part in facilitating this interaction, but it doesn't do it by itself. There's also these, how do you question a text, for instance? So do you ask people, so in the Mile and Kuyken striking and evocative passages, they will say that, okay, it's just the text, they're very text-oriented, and they have a theory about the sublime, so they're very focused on the aesthetic qualities of the text, but still, they are asking people to do something. They say, underline the evocative and striking passages, so it's not just a free paradigm. They are saying, there's already a lot of stuff implicit in asking people what is evocative and what is striking. So it's just not a sort of a free interaction. It is a facilitated or an instructed interaction with a text. So that's one of the questions that I'm interested in. So if it is a certain kind of engagement that will have mental health effects, then how do you create that kind of engagement? Is it a kind of engagement that anybody can have? Why is it that some people will sort of spontaneously do a symbolic reading, or is it because they were taught this in high school? Why is it that some people would just not be interested, or why will other people only be interested in the aesthetic qualities of the text, or why will they do the autobiographical version? Is this something that is it a personality thing? Is it something that we can be taught? Is there a teaching of reading, which means so that we can actually enhance and be better at interacting with text, and this is what creates the engagement. So this is one definition of aesthetic reading that I was curious about. This says if aesthetic reading engagement is to be defined as present, a distinctively intimate mode of being with objects in the world, then it is likely, and this is now my hypothesis, to assume that this state mode of being can be facilitated and potentially modified, or in other words, taught, not learned. Sorry. So my interest is actually on the role of facilitation. What kind of facilitation? What kind of questions? And here, of course, also taking into account that the text is also a question. Some texts ask me to do something, to engage with me in certain ways. But I think Andreas was the one who said something about this. That once you get into a play, I don't know, or a game, but there is an initial step. I mean, the games are there, but it's that sort of transition of, and then now I'm suddenly here. And now maybe I don't have to think about whether it is extrinsic or intrinsic, now I'm just in the game. So how do you make this passage? I mean, that is a process, I think, which can probably be taught how to get into something. There might be instructions for that, or something will be better at it than others. And some of the things that I see in the reading group is, for instance, that was also what I said in the beginning. This is not a sort of very academic or analytic way of reading. I just ask you to say anything that pops into your mind. So it's sort of moving from why to what. That's one of the things that I have learned, that if you ask people what, they start to come with all sorts of elaborate, more sensuous, detailed descriptions of their experience, and not so much why this and that happened. And that creates a different kind of reading engagement. So I'll just end with this, saying that, I don't know if you have already talked about this, but within OECD's definition of reading, which is something we are very concerned with, at least in Denmark, I don't know about other countries, because we always come out very poorly in these PISA tests. They have actually now, from the first time that they defined reading to the second time around, so I forget which year this is, I'm sorry, but I can find the reference. They put engagement in there. So they now say the reading literacy is understanding, using, reflecting on, and engaging with written texts in order to achieve one's goal, to develop one's knowledge and potential, and to participate in society. They found that if they can have people engage, that engage is the mediating factor for reading performance. And if they can have people engage with reading as little as, I think it is 20 minutes a day, they can do away with any socio-economic factors. They're just done away with. So engagement is also this. I mean, if there is something about what I am hypothesizing, that it is not just, it is a state perhaps, but it is something which can be taught. We can be taught how to engage with text. Then it's certainly something that we should explore. I think that's it. I'm sorry, it was a bit unstructured, out of the top of my head. But
I was just wondering if you thought the potential benefits of this sort of activity could be identically reproduced using different media, or is there something text-specific around?
I don't know a lot about other media. I'm sorry. So I couldn't say. I think there's something which is very specific to literary reading, is that it is both. We were talking about this earlier today. It's both affective and cognitive at the same time. So it hits you. It's the gut feeling. It's the chills, but at the same time you're also talking about that feeling, putting it into words. So I think there's something. So for instance, I've been reading with psychotic patients, and this is something which is difficult for them to, because the affective and the cognitive is sort of on different, but not integrated. That's one of the problems, that they cannot integrate the affective with the cognitive. But I think this is something which is particular to reading as a technology, or as a media, whatever you call it, that it actually has these two components very strongly. You can say that about other media as well, I guess, but I don't know how it would translate to, but
just curious.
Yeah.
I think one of the features of literary text might be that there's a big emphasis on theory of mind, where you have the intentions of the characters, you have the intention of the narrator, and often, I mean, that's one of the things that you learn, which you might also get from a film, but maybe not necessarily as big of a focus. So I think that could be one of the benefits of reading specifically.
Yeah. I didn't talk about that today, but yeah, that's something that I talk about sometimes. But now I know that you already talked about this yesterday.
For some reason I was thinking of Nabokov's Lolita as a counter. I don't know if it's a counter example,
Yeah.
but it's one of the most beautifully written
Yeah.
novels in the world, very engaging.
Yeah.
And then the question comes to my mind whether engagement and being engaged in someone else's mind is enough, or the content also matters.
Yeah. Going back to the first, my background question about whether it is important, the theme or the content and the kind of identification. But he's such a complex figure. So I think that you could each of us could easily identify with various aspects of him without never having been near any of the content that.
Yes, I would predict that the reader's theory of mind would improve, nevertheless.
Yeah. We will actually, I didn't talk about this at all, but we will now do a study in which, so we are trying on one hand to develop the shared reading model as an intervention in form for people, it's going to be an add-on for people, sort of a prevention scheme, prevention from relapse for people who have suffered from or still suffers from depression as being going through one of what you here in Denmark call the sort of the ordinary programs, which is an 8-week program, it's never enough. So we'll see if this as an add-on can be a prevention of relapse, and one of the parameters that we are looking at are both mentalization, because we're looking at the relation between mentalization and depression, but also engagement.
I'm wondering, is there a degree of intimacy or social bonding involved in this? Because I feel like the shared experience of these pretty deep emotions is like much beyond the superficial level that strangers typically engage in. I'm wondering if that's part of if there is some sort of therapeutic effect. If that's part of it.
Yes, of course, yes. And so people, this is the most obvious thing to think, is it a group effect, or I don't know, that was not exactly what you said. But
well,
yes,
that gets at the question I have.
yes.
Yeah, like, is it a group thing? Because
Yes.
There certainly are benefits to just reading a book by yourself as well.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, but I think something, I mean, it is a group effect, but on the other hand, it is a group effect created by sharing a piece of literature, because there's so many other things that you could do. So some of the people that I was reading with and also interviewing, they compared it themselves to other group activities and say, so I'm also in a cooking group, for instance, or we meet once a week to eat together, to have dinner together. But there's nothing in that activity which would allow me to talk about how I feel in such a situation. On the other hand, she said, quite often I feel, what is that word? I feel quite alone in this group because of my history of depression. I never had a job, I didn't form a family, I didn't have kids, and these are the things that people, they talk about. So the difference between this activity is there's actually something within the text, within the literary reading, which makes you talk about these things and create. So the intimacy is definitely not, it is a group thing, but the intimacy is not created by being in the group, but by the activity that you do in the group. Yeah.
And I think connecting to your comment that the main advantage of the bibliotherapy is that it's much safer or maybe easier to talk about feelings in general, because I'm not sharing too much about myself. I'm talking about character, or I'm talking about the text, so it's kind of an indirect way to talk about myself. Still, there is a protective
Certainly.
blanket.
Yeah, it makes a big difference. I only once read a biography by Ingmar Bergman, because it is a beautiful one, and I thought, okay, it's a good piece of literature, but that was the only session that I couldn't go through with, because he said, okay, I know that this person was a living person, and he experienced those things, and I experienced those things, and I'll have to leave now. So yes, it creates a protection. It's just being fictionality.
related to that point, work on narrative transportation and the related persuasion. One of the hypothesized mechanisms of that is that if you encounter something that's meant to be a persuasive message or to induce this self-change, you might engage in counter-arguing against it. But as a result of this attention, emotion, engagement with the narrative, you don't have that counter-arguing procedure, which might make you more open to
I'm sorry I've taken way too much time.
I don't think you're. Okay. No, and they don't keep track of time on these days. So like, yeah. But thanks.